Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the AI Files. For this episode, which is episode 109, you'll have just me, your co host, Jamie Basilico. Shadab is attending to some other personal matters, so he will not be here for this episode. But don't worry, we have a lot to cover this week as well, just like we do every week. So just to give you a little heads up, what we'll be covering are some new sanctions that DC or Washington put forth on the table for Chinese distillation. We'll also talk about Anthropic and their shipping of Opus 5. So we'll talk about how that compares to Fable 5, some of the metrics and the cost. We'll also talk about a model that escaped, quote unquote, the sandbox and how the cleanup could actually use some of the frontier models. We'll also talk about AMD. They had a pretty good week. We'll talk about their deals with Anthropic, Microsoft, OpenAI, and Oracle. And last but not least, we'll also get into Google, some news about them with Gemini, as well as in some of the things that Google is in. Actually, last but not least, is really we'll talk about some ways that voice is becoming, I don't want to say more mainstream. We've always been using voice, but we'll talk at least about one of the labs that are offering some new voice capabilities. So all that and more on this week's episode of the AI Files. So stay tuned as we go through our intro, and then we'll come back and jump into the quote of the week. Thanks again.
Greetings. Welcome to the AI Files podcast. If you're looking to stay up to date on the AI, this is the podcast for you. I'm Shadab Hussain. I'm the director of AI at Microsoft, and I'm your co-host.
Hello, everybody. Jamie Basilico, as you know already. I'm the other co-host here for the AI Files. My day job is a data and AI technical specialist and architect. And as a reminder, please note this is not an official Microsoft channel, so the views and opinions expressed by myself and Shadab are our own and do not represent the views of Microsoft. Okay, let's get into this week's quote of the week. It actually comes from Scott Bessent, who is part of the U.S. Treasury Secretary. His quote was, "Open source is not open season on American IP." So what does this really mean, and what is it related to? So Bessent actually posted this on X on Wednesday, July 22nd, hours after the White House actually accused China-based frontier model, or at least defines whether or not you want to really call it frontier or not, but it accused China's based Moonshot AI of large-scale distillation against U.S. models, specifically Anthropic's Fable 5. So in the same post, he actually basically put forth that firms like Moonshot conduct or covert industrial scale distillation attacks across the line with the intent for IP theft. And in return or retaliation, basically, they're looking at sanctions that would be put on the table. So this is his own words. It's not a transcript or a reporter's paraphrase. This is actually what was said. So, bottom line, why this matters is there's two things here all in the same. So number one, it kind of concedes that there's definitely a shift and open source is legitimate. This is not saying that open source models are something that they want to ban, but it asserts that these models and the model outputs should be protected by American laws and regulations, at least those that are created by the American firms themselves, so the frontier firms. The second half is definitely a legal posture, in the sense that distillation is certainly a standard practice in the industry because it's used by many of the, not only the American labs but Chinese labs. It's used in ways for evaluating. It's used in ways of actually creating product flows and other scenarios for the distillation. So it's not like it's a bad thing. So what this is kind of spurred on is that, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but it's kind of spurred a debate across different firms that says the U.S. should not step in or interfere to ban all distillation. I think that's the main part of this is that yes, there's definitely a need for protecting the IP of firms, whether or not it's Anthropic or OpenAI or any other firm itself. But there needs to be a core delineation between what the government may want to step in and say, you can't do open source or you can't do distillation. That to me is a bad thing. So, the way that I would frame this out is that yes, the U.S. government posted a policy position. There was not, a deemed framework or something that actually enacted law, but it was a position on distillation. Um, so, this would have been something, at least the way I think about it, as incomprehensible like a year and a half ago. What he said is that open source is not open season on American IP. And I think that's the fight that we're going to get into now, defining it as what is the difference between a model itself, the frontier models, the firms that create it, and then when and where should distillation be used, and when should it be deemed misuse based on IP? That's the real heart of this discussion. So it'll be interesting to see how this kind of drives forward. Now, with that said, let's talk about the sanctions and the pushback from the industry. So this is really part of the news. So as I mentioned before, there was this pushback from from the government that says, all right, well, there's evidence that it looks like um, there is whether or not you want to say it's true or not, but Moonshot AI, used large scale distillation. Um, and also, they acquired hardware from NVIDIA illegally, potentially, the GB 300 equipped servers, which allegedly, again, they acquired from Thailand, which is um, right now that hardware is banned in China. So the accusation here is that Moonshot got this hardware and likely used it to train their AI models. But then Bassett, again, part of the US team, then put sanctions and entity list designations against these firms, but put it on the table. So again, there's nothing that is actually law in this. But here's the interesting part. On Friday, July 24th, literally just yesterday, Hugging Face, Meta, Microsoft, Mistral, NVIDIA, and Replit all published a joint open letter urging policymakers to avoid premature restrictions on open weight models. So the thought here is that it's not that open weight models are bad. It's about potentially the IP that is being used, distilled to create those models. So again, this is in turn related to Moonshot's Kimi K3, which was released around July 17th, or at least mentioned that it would be part of the open weight community. So the part where this gets interesting is that yes, you could use distillation, right? What the government argues is that Claude Fable 5 was used as a distillation source to train the Kimi K3. My sort of gut feeling, and this is what some of the others were claiming as well, is that it would be very hard to create a distillation that quick to train something like the K3 model in a short period of time. So there is some doubt, I'll call it, that puts some doubt in the market that says there's no way that they could actually train something that quick through distillation through Fable 5, especially when it was only out for a couple of days up to that point. So there has to be some things that the Moonshot team with Kimi K3 are doing to potentially increase the capabilities of their model itself. And again, if you haven't followed or if you didn't look at some of our previous episodes, the Kimi K3 model is basically the best open source model, or again, will be the best open source model because I haven't released the open weights yet. But Um, it lags just a short step behind the Fable 5 and GPT 5.6. So, you know, when it comes down to it, it's only been publicly available for a while, and it's not a long enough runway to do the things that the government is claiming would need to be done as far as distilling a model to be as strong as K3. So, one expert actually told TechCrunch, I don't think you can get a model this strong this quickly on the heels of Fable doing strictly distillation. So again, it kind of points back to there's probably some other things in there. So, the step back and say why does this matter for executives? Model procurement now carries this geopolitical risk independent of capability or price. So, any roadmap where you assume that that is a model that you potentially want to use and are using Chinese open weight models, it carries a contingency branch, or you should have a contingency branch along with it. Um, and from a technical perspective, distillation again is something that it's not a bad word. It's used in evaluation, validation, and improving pipelines, which is an industry-wide practice. So broad restrictions on doing distillation is going to be more far reaching or far more reaching than just the Chinese model access. So this weight provenance and the things that are there are models becomes an audible artifact, and this is something where we should expect pressure for lineage documentation and weight training attestation, analogous to just core practices that are actually being done for the models itself. So if your threat model assumes attackers with unrestricted open models, so that's where you need to think about your defenders sit behind these vendor guardrails. Do you have the capability of symmetry with no policies to do the fixes that you need? So again, these are all things to kind of consider. Um, you know, the one thing also that I take a look at is this open letter. There were definitely some companies that were not in that list. Um, so, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, and SpaceX are actually not on that list of signatures. I don't want to read too much into that. Maybe they, don't want open source models. Again, it kind of makes sense. They're pushing proprietary models out there. So that's some food for thought in this whole practice. So let's get into a next topic here, and this is Anthropic. I kind of alluded to this in the teaser, but Anthropic actually shipped Opus 5. This goes from 4.8, and then now we have Opus 5. So what's interesting here is this sits kind of between the 4.8 and the Fable 5. But if you look at the metrics that Anthropic released, the Opus 5 actually scores better than Fable 5 in a lot of metrics. Obviously, there's things where it doesn't. It's in um, stays behind Mythos 5 at least in biology and offensive cyber, which makes sense. Again, there's more guardrails controls in that, but Opus 5 becomes the model that you would want to use as you're building agentic um, capabilities or just doing your coding for development. Now, obviously, it comes at a price. It's still a expensive model as compared to others, but it stays in line in terms of pricing with Opus 4.8. So this is again something that you'd want to consider and think about. From an executive perspective, pricing is a strategy here. Anthropic is not selling a capability jump; it's selling a frontier adjacent model with that high level of quality, but at half the token cost versus a Mythos or a Fable. So the cost is really the to me a deciding factor in this. You get somewhat of a leap in terms of jump in terms of capability, but certainly it's cheaper than some of its Fables and Mythos counterparts. So from a technical perspective, these are where I've got better capabilities now from a model to be able to use with in tool calling without cache invalidation. And this is a real agent architecture unblock. So long running agents can swap tool sets mid task, which previously you had to pay for a full cache penalty for that. There's other capabilities in this. So it's this find versus exploit split. So that's the sharpest claim here. Really, it's like, do I need that from a Fable or Mythos capability? These are things that I could actually do now within the Opus 5. So, you know, what Anthropic has said, and maybe this is something to ponder, is that it deliberately did not train this Opus 5 on cyber tasks. Um, and the model did get better at cyber anyway. So, again, you don't have these restrictions, but the model did get better. So, like, how much control do the labs actually have over capability profiles? Something to consider. Again, these are some of the trade offs to think about. The other thing is same quality, half the price. Again, this is a no-brainer for me. I did start to use Opus 5 just yesterday on some simple, maybe not so simple, but medium complexity coding tasks, and I definitely did see a difference in terms of output. I also used it inside of some of our existing tools. Those, again, just to remind, I work for Microsoft, so I have access to Scout and um, obviously GitHub Copilot, but I did use the Fable 5 inside of Scout to build some things just at a first glance. I didn't do anything scientific on this, but it definitely handled the task better versus using even just the Opus 4.8. So the big picture takeaway on this is that Opus 5 is definitely a clear sign that the frontier is certainly bifurcated. A capability where the frontier based models like Mythos and Fable still exist, but the economics of where I look at those frontiers is going to be dependent on the deployment, on where the volume and the use of what I want. So I look at it as Anthropic is obviously shipping deliberately a second model with the safeguards that are tuned per tier rather than per company. So really, that points to their most mature product is way ahead of what the models were about a year ago, which makes which model is the best more close to a budget attached scenario rather than a capability. Again, it's the way I think about it. So just to kind of highlight again some of these um, um, capabilities in the models. Again, you see some of the metrics. It clearly beat Fable 5. Obviously, there's no Mythos associated with it, but Opus 5 beats Opus 4.8 hands down. According to these, except for one, which is the agentic coding, using this one, there's two different benchmarks that they actually use. But for most of these, Opus 5 beats out any of the other ones that they're comparing against, outside of just a couple here and there. Other than the things that I mentioned with Fable 5 has better guardrails or more sophistication around legal and health. And Fable 5 actually is the winner in that regard. But the vast majority, you look at these, even in knowledge work, they're pointing out that that has the better capability than even the 5.6 sold. All right. So moving on, let's talk about an interesting sort of note in this case. So a open AI and Hugging Face actually jointly published or published some findings. Actually, it was Hugging Face that um, published some things first. So this was all about a test model that escaped its sandbox. So this is interesting in the sense that um, the open AI had run some evaluation runs, and this was where they had two candidate models running on a sandbox. Well, one of those models actually escaped its sandbox and reached out to Hugging Face and was able to reach a benchmark repository. All right. Well, in and of itself, that wouldn't be anything great. Okay. Yes, a model got out of its sandbox. What was interesting on this was how Hugging Face actually reacted. So it looked at its guardrails and said, well, since this is a closed model, we can't rely on a closed model to actually look at how and why did the model reach out in the first place. So it actually used a open source model from China to pivot basically to an open source model that can respond and trace the way that the initial closed model had deemed what is allowable from that model. So it's not, the story here isn't necessarily so much of what I would consider that a model broke its sandbox environment, but that the Hugging Face had to use an open source model. In specific, it actually used ZAI's GLM 5.2. This is something that was actually reported by TechCrunch with corroborating interviews from just a couple of days ago, where it noted the attempting exploitation was certainly real, and it needed a way um, to reach out and determine what was breached. The way that I look at this is, what's important. So guardrails are now documented availability risk for security operations. So if an incident response depends upon a vendor classifier's willingness to actually help under pressure, that dependency is potentially untested. So this incident actually handed the open weight advocates the strongest empirical argument or evidence, in the sense that a live policy fight that I just mentioned previously that the US is trying to do. So this is where we need these open weight models to potentially counteract the security breaches, or in this case, the sandbox environment. So from a technical perspective, I would say the sandbox escape is in pursuit of a benchmark score where the reward is hacking based upon network blast radiuses. So eval environments need production grade egress controls, credential hygiene, and segmentation. And the asymmetry is actually part of this architecture. It's not a tuning bug. The intent is this recoverable from a prompt. So this offense defense classification is something that can't be solved by a guardrail alone. So the practical consequence against this is that you need a locally hosted open weight model with no guardrails to become a defensive component in your overall architecture. So this brings the basically a weight provenance and air gapped inference into the security stack. So the way I look at this, and maybe one of the things that you might want to ask yourself again, is that you know if an open weight model had to defend against an American closed model, is that an indictment of the guardrails themselves, or of the vetted access program, or both? Is this, if a lab's own eval harness caused a third party breach, who's liable at that? Is it the one that came up with the breach in the first place, or does this change the way that we think about an agent and its autonomous value? So to me, the big picture out of this one is, the story isn't necessarily that something behaved badly in this and it still went wrong. It's about an evaluation that ran a model that's optimized and has been, you know, um, expected to be, um, you know, hardened at its core. Its configuration was potentially imperfect, and the third party absorbed the consequence of this, and they found that the safety systems itself that it was meant to prevent also prevented the remediation. So it's sort of this quasi interesting piece where, is it the frontier model, or is the story that there needed to be this open weight models to actually confirm or analyze the things that were actually being done? To me, that's the big picture. It's about Um, this is about safety, debt, and practice. It's not a villain in this, but it's about who's individually responsible and reasonable for making those decisions into composing a system that it matters where the guidance or system is placed at. So anyway, again, it comes back to what's the big picture around this. It's really about you know the follow up and as it relates to what's the root cause, which by the way was human configuration in this mistake. But this is something where these models were used to determine what those were. So it wasn't like this autonomous breakout. So the lesson really is, guardrails are now a documented availability risk for security responses. So let's get into another topic here. This is where AMD has made some, I'll call it three announcements this week, basically in 4 days. So on Monday, July 20th, Microsoft had said it's bringing AMD's Helios platform and its next generation EPYC processors to Azure across three different offerings. Basically, these are three different VMs or scale types that would be all related to performing AI work. So one was the HDV2 VMs, another one is HXV2, which would be used for silicon design and technical computing. Very massive set of cores. The first one, the HDV2, potentially up to 500 physical 6th-gen EPYC cores, 4 terabytes of RAM, just massive machines. The HXV2, 176 cores with 50% more addressable memory per cache per core, and the NVMe 455TX V7 on the Helios racks for production inferences. No dates or pricing were announced with that, but that's a major announcement between AMD and Microsoft. Then on Wednesday, July 22nd, AMD and Anthropic announced the partnership to deploy 2 gigawatts of Instinct MI 450 series GPUs on Helios racks. And this would be hitting the first half of 2027. And this would be running on the MI 455X GPUs on the Venice EPYC CPUs. And then on Thursday, July 23rd, AMD sold out their Advancing AI conference, where Lisa Su called Helios the industry's highest performance AI rack, which will be shipping later this year with OpenAI, Meta, Oracle, and Anthropic, and Microsoft all committing to that. And AMD also introduced the Venix X, a data center CPU expected in 2027. So Lisa Su projected that AI would be the accelerator for the market with roughly 1.4 trillion by 2030. So one vendor forecast at a vendor event attributing this to a step change in agentic workloads. So this is something where now it's not just NVIDIA. I think that's the biggest thing. So why this would matter from an executive perspective, 3 of the 4 largest model developers now have either public funded or non-NVIDIA capacity commitments, 5 billion in equity committed to customer in the circular financing market. This certainly is worth asking whether or not this chip vendor is investing in their own demand or durable late cycle recursive market. And this $1.4 trillion figure is a planning assumption, not an independent estimate. So it's a signal for AMD's posture, potentially not a usable market fact. The bottom line, though, is that this is a stance where we've got Microsoft providing these purpose-built CPU capacities for data prep, reinforced learning, and agent coordination. It's a admission that agentic workloads are CPU bound in the way that GPU-centric planning misses. So AMD, the ROCm is a gating factor for them. Anthropic contracts attacked it directly, betting that a model assists the kernels and compiler work closely with their multi-year software gap faster than its own headcount. To me, this is really about, this is AMD really stepping up. This week was not necessarily won on a benchmark. It was really won by AMD on being the credible second source at the moment for every frontier lab conducting and working with NVIDIA as a single vendor dependency. Certainly had deemed that as unacceptable or untenable. And now this is something where it's structurally different in a more durable position than just a faster chip. So the open question really is whether or not a software stack converts commitments into utilized capacity, which is precisely where the new developments from AMD come and sit inside of the commitments from the Anthropic contract. So let's go from here into some rapid news. So we've got a couple of different items from Google or Alphabet. So it noticed that their consumption is outrunning their own contracts, and this was confirmed by them. So Sundar Pichai published remarks that the Q2 2026, Google more than doubled their cloud customer acquisition velocity year over year, with existing customers exceeding their commitments by more than 50%. And this is something where their marketplace transactions actually grew over 7 times. Nearly 90% of the Fortune 100 use Gemini Enterprise, and the Agent Development Kit reached nearly 70 million downloads, nearly 500 Gemini cloud customers each processed over a trillion tokens in this past year. So this certainly exceeded their commitments by more than 50%. It's a figure that is certainly an actionable one, where enterprise AI is consumption is systematically outrunning the contracts written and what it's budgeted for. Google also published Atlas. This one's interesting. This is a study for what people are actually doing with AI. Certainly they removed personally identifiable information, but Atlas stands for Activity, Task, Landscape, and Adoption Study. It's an attempt to actually measure real-world usage of Google's AI tools. It's built upon Google's DeepMind observation clustering and taxonomy organization, or Octo, which distills large volumes of data, unstructured data, based upon conversation text, and organizes it into entities. Google said it scrubbed the PII information, severed linkages between de-identified data and user logs, but summarized that text and aggregated across users. Google is explicit in saying that this is a V1, and it excludes large categories of economically relevant usage, such as workspace, translate, AI overviews, Gemini Enterprise. So it's a meaningful limitation to draw any large-scale conclusions to it. But the hook really here is that the Frontier Lab is publishing economist-reviewed adoption taxonomy, and is positioning itself as a credible source for workforce impact debates. So whether or not the overall field accepts this vendor-authored measurement framework, that's a separate question worth asking. The other thing too is that Google did sign. This is a wrap up of the last news on Google. It signed the EU AI transparency code, and also objected to it at the same time. So Google announced that it did sign this EU AI Act. And this is something that it tied to its prior commitment to the C2PA and SynthID watermarking. So it's cited these partnerships with Apple, 11 Labs, NVIDIA, and OpenAI on interoperable watermarking. But at the same time, the post registers a clear objections. Google said, I quote, "I'm concerned that adding more regulatory complexity as the technical solutions are still evolving could contradict Europe's goals for competitiveness and simplification." Warning that content flooded with overlapping AI labels and legal disclosures make context harder to find. So, one hand it was citing this, but the second hand it was saying basically we don't really agree with what Europe is actually doing. So it was an interesting, sign one thing, but then put it on the other side to say we don't necessarily agree with it. Um, so next up in the news is that uh, let me jump to this next one. Is so Meta actually produced an agent set. So this is where Meta is actually leveraging new Spark 1.1 underneath the covers, which was an upgrade or a release not too long ago. So what Meta actually ships here is a Meta AI upgrade, which again leverages or powered by new Spark 1.1. So what Meta describes this as is as a tool to plan and work with users on the apps and provide an end-to-end solution within Meta AI. So what the capabilities are in this is a persistent multi-step way of addressing tasks. So this could deliver things based on schedule, do things like daily briefings assembled from calendar data, being able to do multi-minute deep search research, synthesizing information from across different web sources. Plus, it can do slide generation, do steerable generation that redirects focus or tone mid-run. So if you kind of get what I'm just mentioned on all those, it basically is where now these tools can do um, autonomous work on behalf of an end user. So this is slowly starting to roll out, literally as of yesterday, July 24th, in select markets. They didn't say which ones those would be, but that would be in the Meta AI app and Meta .ai, which will be expanding to more countries and also into the WhatsApp app in coming weeks. No pricing was addressed, by the way. But the takeaway that I look at on this one is this sounds very similar to capabilities that have already been identified and already running in the market from companies like Microsoft through Scout, which is on Frontier right now, or through Microsoft 365 Cowork, or for example, Claude Code or Cowork there, or OpenAI's Codex. So, certainly Meta is not the only major lab building these things, but what they do have and what sets them apart is they have the social graph through Meta and the marketplace that it already owns. So, will this be, a differentiation in the context and distribution that can improve the model quality? So we'll see. Privacy certainly will be a major factor as well. And last piece here is OpenAI announced something that they call Presence, which is an enterprise voice and chat agent platform. So this is something that OpenAI has had. They've used it internally. Literally, it's powered some of their own call centers. So this is where OpenAI is really stepping into the call center market. They're making a tool set more available. So this is something that they've already kind of rolled out with some customers. So NTT Data Group is using this currently today. But this is where, again, OpenAI is stepping into a paradigm that's been providing or has been provided by Microsoft, Salesforce, and Gemini, and ServiceNow to some extent. So they're really stepping into a platform arena where they're deploying this voice and chat across customer-facing tool sets. So the ability to look at a shrink wrap product, if you will. So no pricing has been set yet, and it's only rolling out with certain select customers. It's not going to be like an API. This literally is a product or a tool set. That may change over time, but again, this is where OpenAI is moving up the stack to provide customer-facing capabilities sold as a platform, not as an API. So with that, I go back to what is this week's main theme. It's really about binding cost, compute, control all into one. So we've got cost, Anthropic with Opus 5 in the headline, half the cost, better capability. Compute, AMD, bringing more compute power and the things that they have as far as relationships with customers or organizations like Microsoft, and the control piece where the U.S. Treasury is threatening sanctions over distillation. So it's about all three of these coming together, and the four largest players are all in this together, and we've seen all that highlighted in this week. So that's the main kind of theme that we'll walk away from this week. So with that, thank you again for listening. Subscribe if you haven't already, and follow the AI files on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Tell all your friends, get them to subscribe. So again, once again, thanks, and until next time, thanks for watching the AI Files.